Over the past few years, there's been a subtle shift in cultural conversation toward how art makes us feel seen. Essentially, how art is able to reflect ourselves back to us, either in a way that lends some subjective clarity to our lives, or in a way that simply says, I know how you feel. It's a nebulous concept, but one that is especially crucial to marginalized and thus underrepresented groups. Our experiences aren't often taken into consideration, our stories aren't told, and we wind up gravitating toward a shallow pool of stories that often only happen to brush up against our experiences with zero regard to how we truly operate. I think this is a big part of why media that explores gender, intentionally or otherwise, in a distinctly non-queer way can draw so much ire in online queer communities. Disproportionately, they're as close as we get. They could have been real representation. Maybe they even would have been if the creators had realized that transgender people are real and that they themselves didn't invent them. So when I do find a work that nails the details of what it's like not only to be trans, but what it's like for me specifically, with empathy and effort, I feel like I just have to become a proselyte for it. Because for all the time we spend feeling justifiably frustrated at the visible failures to represent trans people, it's nice to be reminded that there are works that have us in mind to be claimed. Nanae Haruno's 1996 manga Double House opens with a chance encounter that leads transgender bar hostess Maho and former college student Fujiko to learn that they're apartment neighbors. They then develop a close and nuanced friendship, the blossoming of which and the exploration of both characters are the story's main focus. Maho, whose point of view we follow, is flawed, but in ways that make her compelling and human. She's tired of her routine, one that defines her as a transgender woman before it does a person, and one that she feels stuck in, living in an ignorant world that narrows her options for out-of-the-closet work opportunities and meaningful relationships to an almost razor-thin margin. As a result, she's prone to oversharing to those she does spend meaningful time with, in a flippant way that belies little regard for her own feelings or well-being. Likewise, she carries with her the kind of twisted sense of humor that you know comes from a deeper, more pessimistic place. Even in the face of her struggles, Maho is confident and resilient. She has to be. Her neuroses are agitated by a socioeconomic response to her identity, but ultimately exist outside of her gender, and that's really refreshing. The transphobia Maho faces is understatedly structural. There are only a scant few instances of individual characters treating her with malice or ignorance. Her story isn't particularly concerned with depicting the hardships of being trans in a way that feels as though it's meant to teach a cis audience the perceived struggles of being trans, which can often be exhausting for trans people to see over and over again. In Fujiko's case, while a smart, insightful, open-minded young woman, she's had the privilege to be all of the above, having come from a well-to-do family and being, well, cis. On the other hand, Fujiko's life may have appeared pristine, but it wasn't happy. With her parents' failing marriage and the pressure of a similarly doomed arranged marriage looming over her, she made the difficult decision to abandon a life that was set up for her to pursue something that would truly be better for her, even if it's in most other regards more difficult. Between her partial college education and her introspective disposition, she has a habit of overthinking and postulating about the people around her, despite lacking much of the first-hand experience to fully consider the scope of her worldview. This makes Maho feel subconsciously that Fujiko sees her as a specimen, a curiosity not for her identity, but for what the duo have in common. Still, she always means well, something Maho comes to see and appreciate. And while Maho yearns to be seen as a woman, even if in nearly stereotypically feminine ways, Fujiko, who's lived a lifetime under the societal expectations put upon those raised as female, feels resentment toward the stereotypically feminine lens she's so often viewed under. There's a subdued push and pull there, one that can be true of relationships between trans women and gender non-conforming cis women, that kind of mutual grass is always greener yearning for what the other has. The best case scenario, and the route the Double House girls take, is an exchange of understanding born of respect for one another. Maho and Fujiko's relationship is one of contrast, wherein the two's closeness, though easily perceived as being despite their differences, is in reality because of them. They're nearly tessellated opposites, but at the end of the day, Maho and Fujiko are two women who are defying the expectations put upon them, and that's what allows them to see eye to eye, to understand and relate to one another's unique experiences. Much of the manga consists of our protagonists simply conversing, sometimes in their apartments, while gardening, while running errands. It's all fairly low stakes, but it remains engaging in how thoughtfully the dialogue is written. The duo lock into one another very quickly, carrying little of the trepidation that new friends share about feeling one another out, and are able to be very upfront about how they feel and what they think with one another. It's clear the story sees merit and validity in both women's perspectives, allowing them to disagree with one another without drawing clear lines as to who is correct. There is not one holistic truth in the struggle for identity and culture that defines people by the groups they fit into, and that notion is exemplified by the following passage from the manga's first chapter.
Well, I think there are two kinds of people. Those who fit well inside frames, and those who don't.
Frames?
Family, nationality, sex, things like that. They're all frames, aren't they? They exist outside of the body known as I, don't they? I used to live my life inside a gilded frame, but I realized one day that the picture inside the frame was terribly poor. In order to redraw a picture, one has to remove it from its frame. That's what I'm doing right now.
You know, that theory was created by a girl from an affluent family whose pretty face and slender shoulders would lead anyone to call her cute. Not many people are so blessed. Most regular people couldn't live without frames. They need somewhere to put themselves, and I have even less than they do. Call me a drag queen, a tranny, whatever you want, just put me into an established group of people. If I didn't have that, I'd just be a freak. I couldn't stand that.
But Maho-san, you didn't like being in the man frame, so you escaped from it, right?
I suppose.
But you don't really fit in the woman frame either, do you?
That's right. And seeing flirtatious women who are the perfect archetypes of the frame really pisses me off. I wonder why.
I thought so. You're the sort of person who doesn't settle for things, Maho-san. You don't need a frame. Your picture is complete just on its own.
That sounds like it was meant as a compliment, but it's actually a really lonely thing, isn't it? It's like I won't be able to figure out who I am anymore.
Don't worry, you have me.
And how exactly will you be helping me?
Don't you find it encouraging to have someone nearby who shares your inclinations?
Well, maybe you're right. I think in part what speaks to me so much about Double House and why I feel so represented by Maho comes from the things other authors would probably be rightfully apprehensive about addressing. Nanae is always delicate, but not precious per se. When Fujiko tells Maho that she doesn't fit into the frame of a woman, she isn't saying you're not fully a woman, but instead that you're not what society at large has dictated a woman is, and that that's a two-way street. I think the latter for some could be painful to be told, but for me it was a very freeing thing to see put into words. I'm unequivocally a woman, but I exist outside of the commonplace ideas of womanhood. Basic stuff, but some of those ideas just don't fit who I want to be. I don't have to commit to the concepts of womanhood that don't resonate with me to be a woman to the fullest extent, even though there are times I wish I wanted to. I won't act like that doesn't make certain aspects of navigating life as a woman more difficult, but at the end of the day, I am still living truths to myself. And that's true too of Maho, even if in some regards she also doesn't fit in amongst her fellow trans-feminine peers. Yet another aspect of Double House's depth and specificity lies in its acknowledgement of the very unique schism early queer cultures had toward their own intersections. There was very much so a common presupposition that when you transition, you'll seek out a heterosexual romance, that's sort of the long-term goal for transition, to assimilate as close as you can to cisness. This is still true today in how a lot of cis straight folks view queer people. I've literally had coworkers start misgendering me when they find out I have a girlfriend. Like, it doesn't compute to these people that I am simultaneously trans and a lesbian. Now imagine how alienating that would feel coming from within your own community. This isn't to say that Maho and Fujiko's relationship is even explicitly romantic, but that the time they spend is enough to draw this ire from Maho's peers. Can you believe that all of that is jam-packed within just 3 chapters? Yeah, and I was bummed that Hibari-kun ends on an abrupt note. They're a meaty 3 chapters at about 50 pages each, and with a lot to say, but there's not a lot of time for these characters to develop in a direction one could map out to a definitive conclusion. It makes me sad that I'm not able to spend more time with the cast, but I've made peace with that and almost find it kind of nice in a sense that the nature of Maho and Fujiko's relationship is left unspoken, that it exists in a state as indefinable as the frames they operate in. Still though, it's bothersome that its final chapter shifts some of the focus away from Maho and Fujiko and onto something more fraught. Yeah, so here's where we get the closest to an asterisk attached to Double House. Chapter 3 hones in on Coco, one of Maho's also transgender coworkers, who, in a desperate bid to fuel the fulfillment of motherhood, delusionally takes a seemingly abandoned baby home from the park to raise as her own. Yikes. Pretty loaded premise, huh? On paper it sounds like kind of a bad time, but in practice it's mostly handled with the same empathy and delicacy as everything else in Nanae's body of work. Were this the focus of the entire manga, I'd feel pretty uncomfortable about it, but it's cut and dry that this isn't being presented as something intrinsic to the trans feminine psyche. The undercurrent there is simply that, were Coco able to adopt as a single mother, she wouldn't feel as though she had to resort to kidnapping. There's also a kind of weird through line that Coco is more intrinsically nurturing because she's fat and therefore softer than someone like Maho, which is weird but unfortunately not inconsistent with the other ways the manga uncritically bumps elbows with cultural fat phobia. Look, I promise this isn't all as whack as it sounds, just chalk it up to being 1996. At the end of the day, as a reader, we are always in the minds of its characters, never strictly observers, so at no point are we meant to look on at these characters with any sort of voyeuristic confusion. The reader is meant to come to understand its cast just as they do one another. I think what is perhaps most interesting about Double House is its demographic. It was serialized in Young You, a now defunct josei magazine. When you look at a good chunk of other manga with a focus on trans feminine characters, many of them were serialized in magazines aimed at a male demographic. It would be much more of a bad faith read that I'm willing to give these works to outright say that they fundamentally view their trans feminine characters as male, but I do think a lot of cis writers subconsciously view transition as kind of a male hero's journey. One where the hero's transformation is into a woman, sure, but still one that starts off with a male hero, rather than being a story about a woman coming into her own. This could sound like a big difference, but it's really in the weeds. I don't think it necessarily makes for worse stories, but I do think it explains why so many trans narratives, both in manga and in general, are a trans woman's coming out story. All of this is to say, in Double House's case, it really feels like author Nanae Haruno unequivocally views Maho as just as much a woman as any other Young You protagonist, and that means a lot to me. It's also something that is reflected in how Maho is depicted visually. She's beautiful, decidedly feminine, and has certain features that are typically associated with masculinity. She's tall, she has broad shoulders and a flat chest, her features are defined, but she's always drawn with grace in Nanae's signature loose, flowing style. It's difficult to articulate these details in ways that don't sound negative, or at least loaded, so I guess this is kind of an up-to-you thing. I will say that I think there's a significant distinction from caricature or fetishization and how Double House depicts trans bodies. But either way, it'll land with some folks, it won't for others, and that's fine. For me personally, I far and above prefer Double House's stylistic choices to manga where a trans girl puts on a wig or wears a dress for the first time and passes instantly. I get why that's appealing to other folks, it has its purposes, but it's nice to see the work that goes into transition and presentation reflected in art. Really, it all comes down to individual preference. Everyone wants something unique out of representation, which is why a breadth of media depictions of different groups is so important. I feel exceptionally lucky to have found something that speaks so wholly to me about my experience with gender as Double House, and I recognize that on some level, that's a privilege. The world can only benefit from more stories about more kinds of people, those who fit well inside of frames and those who don't. If you want to read Double House, there's a link in the description to the lovely scanlation done by the folks at Lilylicious. Thanks for watching.